For centuries, one name has whispered through the shadows of sacred history: Enoch. A figure so enigmatic he walked with God and then, in a blink, vanished from the earth. Genesis tells us he walked with God, and then he was no more, for God took him. But have you ever pondered why this man, so close to the Creator, left behind something so potent, so unsettling, it was struck from the Bible as we know it today? What if I told you Enoch didn't just disappear, he left a book? A narrative so profound it unnerved the early church. The question is, why was this book concealed from us? Who chose to silence it, and when? And most crucially, what was in this book that threatened the very bedrock of faith? Join me as we unravel the enigma of the Book of Enoch. Let's uncover why this sacred text was removed from the Bible, what secrets it held, and why it posed a danger to the structures of belief. Ready to dive in? Drop a 777 in the comments if you're set to walk this rare and captivating path with me. Trust me, you'll want to stay for every twist in this journey. And if the idea of hidden visions, forbidden knowledge, and ancient angelic encounters stirs something deep within you, just as it did when I first discovered these writings, then you're exactly where you belong. Because what you're about to uncover isn't just history, it's a portal. A portal into the world of a man most Christians know only by name, yet whose influence lingers through time in whispers and shadows. Why is the Book of Enoch not in the Bible? And if the thought of hidden visions, forbidden knowledge, and ancient angelic encounters stirs something deep within you, just as it did when I first uncovered these writings, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because what you're about to discover isn't just history, it's a doorway. A doorway into the world of a man most Christians know only by name, yet whose influence echoes through time in whispers and shadows. Who was Enoch, really? The Bible offers sparse details, but what it does say is almost poetic, almost otherworldly. In Genesis 5 verse 24, it simply states, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. No mention of death, no final breath, just gone, taken, swept into the divine. But what if that wasn't the end of his story? What if it was just the beginning? Because what most people don't know is that ancient texts, some preserved in fragments, others hidden in secret libraries, speak of Enoch not just as a righteous man but as a chosen witness to the heavens. These texts claim he was shown the framework of the cosmos, the secrets of the stars, the fall of angels, and the ultimate fate of mankind. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like if God parted the veil for you, even for a moment? What if you saw things no one else was permitted to speak of? The Book of Enoch, also known as First Enoch, was originally written in Aramaic and was widely known among Jewish communities long before Christ's birth. It was read and revered, even referenced by early church fathers and echoed in the writings of Jude in the New Testament. So why was it silenced? The book describes a group of fallen angels called the Watchers, who descended from the heavens, took human wives, and birthed a race of giants, the Nephilim. You may have glimpsed them in Genesis 6, but Enoch tells their story in vivid detail. He recounts the angels' sins, their judgment, and the chaos their offspring unleashed on the earth. Can you imagine being chosen to witness all of that firsthand? Enoch isn't just a bystander in this cosmic drama. He's taken up to the heavens by angels. He sees the very throne of God. He walks through the 10 layers of heaven, witnesses the eternal books of life and judgment, and even glimpses the prison where rebellious angels are bound in chains, awaiting their final sentence. How would you react if you stood at the edge of that divine courtroom? Yet what sets Enoch apart is that he's not overwhelmed or destroyed by these visions. He's sent as a messenger. God entrusts him with truths not meant for ordinary eyes. He's tasked to write, to record, to leave behind scrolls that might one day resurface when the world is ready for the truth. But if that's true, why was his voice buried for centuries? Why were his writings cast out from the canon, locked away like they were dangerous? And here's the mystery: the Book of Enoch survived despite suppression, despite exile from official doctrine. It lived on, hidden, copied in secret, whispered in ancient tongues. And that's exactly where the story starts to make people uneasy. What were they trying to hide? And if you were in Enoch's shoes, if angels came for you in the night, if heaven pulled you beyond the veil, would you be ready to see what he saw? Or would you, like most, choose to look away? The truth, quietly buried beneath centuries of theological edits and institutional decisions, is that in the earliest days of Christianity, the Book of Enoch wasn't some obscure, dusty scroll forgotten in a corner. Quite the opposite, it was vibrant, alive, and deeply woven into the spiritual dialogue of the time. Christian leaders didn't just know of it, they revered it. It was read aloud in churches, discussed in early councils, and treated with sacred respect. You see, before orthodoxy hardened into rigid lines, faith was still fluid, still full of awe. Back then, believers were more open to embracing mystery, to entertaining revelations that weren't always linear or safe, and to opening their hearts to the symbolic language of heaven, angels, and judgment. And then came a discovery that shook me. Hidden in plain sight, tucked inside a letter so brief most Christians overlook it, is a verse that hits like a thunderclap of truth. In the Epistle of Jude, just one chapter long, verse 14 states, "Behold, the Lord is coming with thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." But here's the twist, that quote isn't from Genesis. It isn't from Isaiah. It's not found anywhere else in the canon. It's a direct quotation from the Book of Enoch. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. Jude, the very brother of Jesus, a man who grew up with the Messiah and was intimately tied to the early church, quoted Enoch as a prophet, not a poet, not a mere storyteller, but as someone who foresaw the return of the Lord with divine armies. Doesn't that raise questions? If someone so close to Christ, so trusted by the early Christian community, viewed Enoch's writings as prophecy, then what changed? Why was he quoted in Scripture by one of Christianity's foundational figures, only to be erased from the official canon later? And it doesn't end there. As I kept digging, I noticed how familiar Enoch's vision sounded. The cosmic battles, the angelic judgments, the fire, the scrolls, the thrones, it was all there, not just in Enoch but echoed in Revelation, in Peter's letters, in Paul's celestial metaphors. Was it possible that the apocalyptic imagination of the New Testament, so vivid, so poetic, was first kindled by the ancient pages of Enoch's visions? Because in Enoch, we see the architecture of heaven. We hear the thunder of God's judgment long before John ever stood on the island of Patmos. Could it be that what we now call New Testament prophecy was built on Enoch's unseen foundation? But then, somewhere in history, the tone shifted. Reverence gave way to resistance. Acceptance turned to suppression. It was as though someone, or something, decided that this voice, once honored, had become too dangerous to echo through the church. And that raises the question, what were they afraid of? What would you have done if you were in those early councils, holding a scroll that told of angelic rebellion in heavenly realms, sensing it revealed too much? Would you have preserved it, or would you, too, have voted to silence it? Was it fear that led to its removal, or power, or perhaps a growing discomfort with a text that didn't fit the neat categories men tried to build around divine truth? The answer, as we'll see next, may be far more tangled and far more revealing than anyone expected. The disappearance of the Book of Enoch from mainstream Christianity didn't happen with the thunder of a gavel or the flash of a sword. It was quieter, slower, a deliberate erosion, orchestrated step by leaders who weren't merely trying to build the church. They were trying to control it. What began as an open stream of spiritual exploration, filled with prophecy, mystery, and apocalyptic vision, gradually became a walled garden. And anything that didn't fit within those walls, anything that threatened the tidy structure of doctrine, had to be removed, stone by stone, scroll by scroll. Among the texts that most deeply disturbed this emerging system was the Book of Enoch. Can you imagine holding a manuscript filled with visions of angels chained in eternal darkness, of rulers judged in flames, of a heavenly Son of Man seated beside the Ancient of Days before Jesus had even walked the earth? What would you do with such a book? By the 4th century, the church was no longer just a movement of persecuted believers meeting in homes and catacombs. It was becoming something else, something imperial, something political. With the support of the Roman Empire, church leaders began the monumental task of shaping a unified canon, one that would guide the faith of millions. It was during this era that the Council of Laodicea took place, around 363 to 364 AD. Though overshadowed in history by the Council of Nicaea, Laodicea played a pivotal role in deciding what was officially in and what was not. And in their Rule 60, a list was created, a sacred catalogue of texts permitted to be read aloud in churches, the canon, the standard. But as this list formed, the Book of Enoch was quietly left behind. Was it overlooked by accident? Hardly. This wasn't an omission, it was an intentional exclusion, a theological decision, yes, but also a political one. The Book of Enoch was wild, mysterious, filled with language that defied institutional boundaries. It didn't just teach about good and evil, it exposed the corrupt. It prophesied against rulers, warned of divine justice raining down on kings, and told of heavenly beings who rebelled and paid the price. It didn't ask permission, it declared judgment. And perhaps most controversial of all, Enoch wrote of a figure called the Son of Man, radiant, glorified, sitting at God's right hand in glory and authority, long before the Gospels were written. This messianic vision, so detailed and majestic, was uncomfortable for the Church of the Roman Empire. Why? Because it reminded the powerful that authority didn't belong to emperors or bishops. It belonged to God and His chosen one, long before their version of the story was complete. If you were part of an empire-backed church tasked with maintaining order, loyalty, and unity under Rome, would you allow a text like that to circulate? Would you let people read of angels bound for their crimes, of divine wrath aimed not at pagans but at corrupt leaders within God's own people? Or would you silence it? And so, silence came. A deep, heavy silence, not just a decision to close a book but to bury it for generations. What else, we must ask, was lost in that silence? What voices of warning, what glimpses of the divine, what truths too raw for empire? Centuries would pass before Enoch would resurface, whispers turning to discovery, discovery turning to debate. But by then, the foundation had been laid. The damage, or the protection, was done. But here's the question that lingers: was the silence meant to protect the faithful or to protect the powerful? And if you had lived back then, if you'd heard Enoch's words echoing in a candlelit gathering, felt their truth in your bones, would you have dared to speak them aloud, or would you, like so many others, have whispered them and watched them vanish into the shadows? But let's be clear, church leaders didn't erase the Book of Enoch without a rationale. No, they built an entire scaffolding of justifications around its removal. These weren't crude denials, they were calculated, intellectual, and, on the surface, almost reasonable. They claimed Enoch was too fantastical, filled with strange visions and celestial codes that blurred the line between theology and imagination. They said it was too symbolic, too mystical, too open to misinterpretation, and therefore ripe for heresy. Better to keep the faithful away from something so difficult to digest, they argued. Better to protect them. But was it really protection, or censorship disguised as concern? Because when you look closer, the issue wasn't that Enoch was confusing. It was that Enoch was too clear, too raw, too direct. It laid bare uncomfortable truths that few dared to speak. It didn't just whisper about judgment, it shouted it from the heavens. Enoch wrote of divine punishment not only for the wicked but for kings, priests, and angelic beings who abused power. He dared to call out corruption in both spiritual and earthly realms. And that clarity struck at the very spine of the institution being built. Can you imagine how dangerous that would have sounded in a world where faith was becoming centralized under human authority? And then there was the logistical dilemma, quiet but no less strategic. The Book of Enoch never gained a strong foothold in Greek or Latin, the dominant languages of the Roman Empire and the Western Church. It existed primarily in Aramaic and later in Guizi, the ancient Ethiopian tongue. That made it foreign, elusive, untranslatable for many, and, crucially, difficult to control. A text that leaders couldn't easily read or circulate was a text they couldn't monitor. How do you enforce doctrine when a scroll travels silently through cultures beyond your grasp? Would you suppress it, or risk letting the unfiltered truth spread? But perhaps the most volatile element of all wasn't linguistic or symbolic, it was spiritual. The Book of Enoch found favor among groups the early church came to label as dangerous: the Essenes, the Gnostics, the mystics who dared to believe that divine connection didn't require a bishop's blessing. These movements bypassed institutional hierarchy. They sought God directly, in visions, in solitude, in personal revelation, and they often turned to Enoch's writings as validation. Can you feel the tension? In a time when the church was solidifying itself as the one true gatekeeper of truth, any text that encouraged unmediated access to God was not just inconvenient, it was threatening. Because Enoch gave people something the growing church feared most: spiritual freedom. It wasn't just heresy they feared, it was independence. Enoch's prophecies stirred questions. His visions awakened hunger. His warnings unsettled the systems being carefully built. So what do you do when a text can't be easily interpreted, controlled, or dismissed, yet speaks too loudly to be ignored? Do you preserve it, or do you bury it? What would have happened if the Book of Enoch had remained within the canon? How differently would Christianity have developed if every believer had access to those heavenly visions, those judgments, those unfiltered truths? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if you had been there, a believer seeking truth amid rising institutional control, would you have followed the voice of the church or the voice echoing from Enoch's ancient pages? But in the end, we're left with a piercing question, one that echoes louder the deeper we go: who actually benefited from removing the Book of Enoch? Because that may be one of the most revealing questions in this entire mystery. Peel back the layers of history, and a troubling pattern emerges. The moment Enoch was silenced, something else rose in its place, something carefully structured, tightly controlled, and increasingly reliant on institutions rather than encounters. The center of faith shifted from the personal to the political, from divine relationship to religious hierarchy. What if the decision to erase Enoch wasn't simply about theology but about control? Because the faith Enoch offered was radically different. His story didn't require temples built of stone or robed priests standing between man and God. Enoch was a man, mortal, flawed, unordained, yet he walked with God. He was lifted into the heavens, entrusted with secrets of creation, given visions of judgment and eternity, allowed to speak with archangels and see realms no eye had seen. And all of it, without passing through a single institution. Can you feel the weight of that? Can you imagine what it would mean to the early church if every believer believed they, too, could ascend, could witness, could speak with God face to face? It would have changed everything. And maybe that's why his book had to go. Because Enoch was dangerous, not because he was deceptive, but because he was too empowering. He stood as living proof that direct access to the divine was not reserved for elites or clergy or emperors. His life made one thing uncomfortably clear: you don't need permission to walk with God. For a church intertwining itself with empire, molding itself into the spiritual engine of Rome, that message was revolutionary, and threatening. Because if people followed Enoch's example, if they sought revelation for themselves, then the carefully crafted chain of command, the system of interpretation, confession, mediation, would begin to crumble. And without that system, where would the power go? So the removal of Enoch wasn't just about a scroll. It was about silencing the idea that heaven could speak to you directly, that divine wisdom wasn't locked behind cathedral doors but written into the soul of every seeker bold enough to ask. That there is no barrier, no wall, no need for a title when God chooses you. And for the church hierarchy, silencing that voice was strategic, brilliant, even if your goal was consolidation. Because once Enoch was gone, so too was the invitation he extended to every believer: come and see for yourself. Can you see it now? What was lost wasn't only a book. It was a worldview, a call, a connection. For those in power, removing Enoch secured the gates. But for those yearning for revelation, for raw communion with the divine, it was a devastating theft. So what if you had known Enoch's story all along? What if, from the start, your faith had been shaped not by rigid systems but by the whisper that you, too, could walk with God? What if the heavens were always closer than they told you? And now that the truth is resurfacing, what will you do with it? And yet, the silence was never total. Though the West turned its face from Enoch, though his words were stripped from church readings, banished from altars, and scrubbed from official records, a flicker of light still burned quietly in the East. In one ancient land, far from the halls of Rome and the debates of councils, the Book of Enoch was not erased, it was embraced. That land was Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest surviving Christian communities on earth, made a different choice. While others closed the door on Enoch's visions, Ethiopia opened its arms. They didn't just tolerate the Book of Enoch, they canonized it. They honored it as sacred scripture, And to this day, it remains enshrined in their biblical tradition. But how? How did this treasure survive the centuries when it was buried and forgotten in so many other parts of the world? The answer lies in the remote mountains, in the quiet monasteries hidden among ancient stone. It was there, amid candlelight and the rhythm of prayer, that monks carefully hand-copied the Book of Enoch in the Guizi language, a language older than many nations. Page by page, line by line, they preserved not just words but a vision. The text was read during worship, honored during liturgy, woven into the spiritual memory of a people who never forgot. Can you imagine that? While Western Christianity aligned itself with kings, councils, and political empires, this distant, devout community cradled a book that dared to speak of justice greater than any human throne. Ethiopia didn't just protect a manuscript, it protected a message, one too radiant, too dangerous, too divine to be extinguished. And that, to this day, blows my mind. Because while the power centers of the West tightened their grip on doctrine, Ethiopia quietly kept the flame alive, a flame not fueled by politics or empire but by reverence. While one half of the church was defining orthodoxy through exclusion, the other half, more isolated perhaps but more mystically rooted, held on to a vision of heaven untouched by man-made walls. Why do you think that happened? Was it coincidence or providence? Perhaps Ethiopia, untouched by the same imperial machinery, had the freedom to listen more closely to the Spirit. Perhaps their worship remained tuned to something ancient, something raw, something that reminded them of Enoch's journey, not from temple to temple, but from earth to heaven. Because in Enoch's world, justice didn't come from religious titles. Truth didn't come from political decrees. And heaven didn't wait for permission to speak. And maybe that's why, even without the cathedrals or the crowns, the Ethiopian church carries a kind of spiritual weight that feels older, purer, as if it was born closer to the sky. So imagine this, if the Western world had listened to Ethiopia, had preserved Enoch, honored the visions, read those sacred words aloud in every church, what kind of Christianity would we have today? And now that the book has found its way back to the surface, back to our generation, what will you do with it? And now, maybe you're asking the question that lingers in the minds of all who come close to this mystery: what exactly did the Book of Enoch say that made it so dangerous, so disturbing, that it had to be hidden from view? Out of all the ancient writings, few dared to speak as boldly, as fearlessly, as Enoch. This wasn't a text that played it safe. It ripped the veil away and revealed the kind of cosmic drama most people were never meant to see. According to Enoch, the angels didn't merely fall, they chose to fall. They weren't tricked or misled. No, they made a conscious decision. They looked down from the heavens, saw the beauty of human women, and were filled with desire. These angels, known as the Watchers, descended to earth not with holy intent but with rebellion in their hearts. They took wives. They made covenants with one another. And they didn't come empty-handed. They brought knowledge, knowledge never meant for mankind. What kind of knowledge, you ask? They taught sorcery and magic, astrology and signs, how to forge weapons of war, how to manipulate metals. They taught enchantments and root cutting, even how to enhance physical beauty with cosmetics. At first glance, it might sound like advancement. But Enoch makes it clear, this wasn't progress. It was corruption. It twisted the earth. It infected the heart of creation. And the result was terrifying. From the union of these angels and humans came the Nephilim, giants unlike anything the world had seen. Creatures of chaos, filled with violence, insatiable. The text describes them as devourers, of animals, of crops, of men. Earth groaned under their weight. And it was this spreading corruption, this unnatural blight, that provoked the judgment of heaven. According to Enoch, this is what triggered the Great Flood. But Enoch's journey didn't end with the chaos on earth. In a vision that defies all comprehension, Enoch was lifted into the heavens. Imagine that, an ordinary man, swept beyond the clouds, past the stars, into the very courts of heaven. There, he saw things only the purest souls could withstand. He beheld the mighty archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel, as they bound the rebellious watchers in chains of fire. He saw the Book of Life, the eternal record of all souls. He was shown the 7 levels of heaven, each more radiant and terrible than the last. He saw the chambers where souls await judgment, where the righteous rest and the wicked tremble. But then came the vision that silences even the boldest reader. Enoch saw the throne of the Almighty, and beside that throne stood a figure, mysterious, radiant, enthroned in glory. He was called the Son of Man. This was no ordinary being. He was pre-existent, existing before the stars were hung in the sky. He was judge over nations, given power and dominion. He brought justice not only to the earth but to the heavens. He was Messiah before the manger. He was Redeemer before the cross. In Enoch's vision, the Christ is not merely promised, he is already reigning, already active, already revealed. Doesn't that raise unsettling questions? If Enoch was already proclaiming a divine Son of Man, enthroned and empowered, before the New Testament was even imagined, what does that say about our understanding of prophecy? What does it mean that such a clear image of Christ existed outside the bounds of the official canon? Maybe that's why this book frightens so many. Because the Book of Enoch doesn't just invite you to read, it invites you to see. And once you've seen it, once you've walked through the heavens with Enoch, stood before the throne, watched the angels fall, heard the voice of the Son of Man, you can never see the world the same way again. And perhaps that's the real danger, not that the Book of Enoch is too obscure or too strange, but that it's too true, too revealing, too unfiltered for a system that preferred its mysteries locked behind stained glass and stone. So now that you know, would you dare to read it for yourself? And if you did, what might you begin to see? After it was officially excluded, the Book of Enoch didn't vanish in fire or fury. There was no dramatic decree, no headlines proclaiming its heresy, no armies ordered to burn it from the shelves of history. No, its disappearance was far more subtle, more calculated. Like a sacred candle slowly starved of oxygen, the light dimmed, flickered, and then seemed to go out. In the churches of the Roman Empire, the copying stopped. No more scrolls, no more translations. Scribes who once preserved the words of saints and prophets simply moved on. And in the great monasteries that once guarded the treasures of faith, the Book of Enoch was quietly removed from the rotation. No more readings in the liturgy, no more public discussions, just silence. And with each generation, that silence deepened. What happens to a book when no one reads it? What happens to a vision when no one dares to speak it? Without new copies, the book became like a ghost, present only in fragments, echoing faintly through the shadows of forgotten texts. A line here, a phrase there, hints buried in rabbinic commentaries, whispers preserved in Gnostic scripture, subtle allusions in apocryphal scrolls. But the full text, the voice of Enoch in its entirety, it was gone. It became a name with no story, a door no one could open. And so the West forgot. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, Enoch had all but disappeared from Christian memory. The book that once shook the heavens, that once stood on equal ground with revered prophets, became invisible, hidden not just by censorship but by time. Until one day, centuries later, the silence broke. In the 18th century, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce dared to go where few would, deep into the highlands and monasteries of Ethiopia. He spent years among the monks, listening, searching, learning. And when he returned, he carried with him not gold or jewels but something infinitely more rare, 3 complete copies of the Book of Enoch, written in ancient Ge'ezi. After so many centuries, it was like unearthing a buried temple. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to hold that manuscript in your hands, to read words no one in the West had seen for 1,000 years? Like finding the heartbeat of a prophet sealed in silence. Like opening a vault and discovering the sky inside. And yet, even after this miraculous rediscovery, the Church did not restore the book. No councils were reconvened, no amendments made, no apologies issued. The canon remained closed. Enoch stayed outside the gate, welcomed only by scholars, mystics, seekers, and souls like you and me who hunger for the truth behind the veil. But here's what struck me most: the more I read Enoch, not just as text but as testimony, the more I realized this wasn't just a book that was lost. It was a vision that was stolen. A revelation not meant to sit on a dusty shelf but to awaken something ancient in the soul. Enoch didn't write for institutions. He wrote for hearts, yours, mine, anyone with the courage to look beyond religious borders and listen to the language of heaven. And now that his words are rising again, now that the silence is breaking, how many other voices were buried the same way? How many truths were erased, not because they were false, but because they were too true? Because they threatened the comfortable, because they shattered the illusion that only the elite could hear from God, because they gave ordinary people permission to see the divine for themselves. So I'm left with a question burning in my spirit. And maybe it's burning in yours too. How many other revelations were hidden simply because they set people free? So now you know, the Book of Enoch wasn't forgotten by accident. It was removed with intent, buried with care, and almost lost to history. And yet, despite silence, suppression, and centuries of exile, it found a way back, like truth often does. But maybe the real question isn't why it was taken out of the Bible. Maybe it's why it's coming back now. Why is this ancient voice echoing once more in our time? Why, in an age flooded with noise, is this hidden book stirring hearts and minds again? Could it be that this generation, your generation, is ready to hear what others were afraid to face? Because the lessons of Enoch aren't just about the past. They speak to today. We live in a world still wrestling with corrupted power, hidden agendas, and people being told they're not qualified to hear from God directly. We still grapple with systems that prioritize control over communion, image over intimacy, and doctrine over divine experience. But Enoch shows us another path. He reminds us that you don't need a title to walk with God. You don't need permission to receive revelation. You don't need a temple made of stone to be invited into the courts of heaven. What you need is hunger, obedience, a heart that says, "Here I am, Lord. Speak." So maybe it's time we ask ourselves, what else have we been taught to ignore? What ancient truths have we allowed to slip through our fingers because they didn't fit into man-made boxes? And most importantly, what would happen if you stopped waiting for permission and started seeking God for yourself? You see, Enoch's story was never just his. It was a prophetic blueprint for those bold enough to follow. For people like you, who are tired of the surface, tired of watered-down truth, tired of being told what you can't understand. Now is the time to go deeper, to rediscover what was hidden, to reclaim what was buried. So if this stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Pick up the Book of Enoch. Read it. Wrestle with it. Pray through it. Let it challenge you. Let it change you. And share this journey with others who are ready to see with spiritual eyes. Because the truth is rising again. And maybe, just maybe, you were chosen to be one of the voices that brings it back to life. If this message awakens something in you, comment 777 below to let others know you're on this journey too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone hungry for deeper truth. And to those who've supported this channel through super thanks, thank you. Whether you give or simply listen, your presence here is a gift. May you walk with God the way Enoch did, closely, fearlessly, and forever. Amen.